what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the structure that I use for helping people to develop programs that are really successful, that are able to get them really great results over the course of their winter training, so that they come out the other end absolutely flying, set up for their racing season and ready to go. If you have any questions along the way, please just feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to pause periodically to go through and answer questions that people have asked along the way. And so I don't want to just wait to the end. If you've got questions, if there's things that you'd like to ask about, just drop them in and we'll get to them as we go through, rather than waiting till the end. So to start off with, contrary to popular belief, races are not actually won in the spring or in the summer. That's just when they get claimed. And so what do I mean by that? Well, it's very difficult to get dramatically fitter over the course of a month or two, unless you're coming from a very, very low base. And so once racing starts, that process almost becomes impossible, because you're not only limited by the training that you can do, it's also the issue that you're racing every few weeks, you're tapering, you're traveling, you're recovering. There's sessions that you're doing for tactical preparation, there's mental fatigue, there's logistics, and all of these things start to take time and energy out of you actually being able to train and get the benefit from it. So you've got a regatta, you start to, on a Saturday, you lose that long session that you used to have on a Saturday. You do an easy session on the Friday because you've got to load a trailer, you lose the training from that. So all of a sudden, having a regatta on a Saturday when you come back into the spring racing season, you actually basically lose 2 training sessions. And unless you're able to get the boat rigged but before the start of your next session, you potentially even lose 3 sessions to going to regatta. So what ends up happening is a lot of rowers actually get slower over the course of the season. Now, or rather, they actually lose fitness. So the boat might get faster as the technical elements and the crew coming together all serves to improve the quality of a boat's performance. But on an individual level, the athletes can actually be slower. And what a lot of people see is if they do erg testing at the beginning of spring and summer season, or the end of winter, and then they do it again, in June or July, or whatever it might be, towards the end of the racing season, often they either haven't improved or they've even gone backwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive into how to prevent that, but the actual topic of how to continue to get faster through race season would be its own entirely separate topic that would need some discussion and deserve some discussion. So what we're going to focus on today is the winter training element and how you can best set yourself up to be ready to perform. And it's difficult, maybe even impossible, to get fitter once that sprint season actually begins, or from March. And so the real question then becomes, where in your season are you actually going to get fitter? Where are you going to build the engine that's going to support your performance when it comes to racing? And the answer, and what this is all about, is the winter. It's about winter training. So winter training is where you build the engine that is going to power you through your entire spring and summer racing season. So it's where you create the foundations that are going to allow you to sharpen later. It's about banking performance capacity while you have the opportunity to train really, really well. So before I explain why winter training is this most important fitness window in your season, let's just start by defining what I actually mean by it, because I appreciate that some of the people watching this are going to be in the Northern Hemisphere, some are going to be in the Southern Hemisphere. For some people, the docks come out in October. For others, you might be rowing right through the new year, even if it is actually winter. So when I say winter training, what I actually mean is the block of time from the end of your most important head race to the resumption of sprint race training in the new year, or sprint racing in the new year. So for a lot of people, that might actually be right now. You might have just wrapped up the head of the Charles, or it could be about to be upon you. You might be looking ahead to Silver Skiff, or head of the Hooch, or Veterans Head in the UK, or even head of the Yarra down in Australia, where it's very much not winter, but for our purposes, we would treat it in the same way. So depending on where you are, sprint racing is going to kick off again in sometime between late January and early April. So we're talking about a window that, depending on where you are and what you're working towards, could be anywhere from 8 to 16 weeks long. So from a pure training perspective, this is the most impactful period of your entire year. So why is winter training the most important part of the season? Well, it comes down to 3 main things, and that's physiology, focus, and freedom. So in terms of physiology, which is where we should start, your body only adapts when 2 things happen. So you either have consistent training stress, and you also have enough recovery to absorb it. So if you don't have one of those 2 things, you're not going to make physiological improvements from training. If you don't do enough stress, your body has nothing to recover from. If you don't give it enough recovery, it never gets to the point of actually adapting to the training. It just tries to survive. So during racing season, that balance becomes really difficult to hit, because even if you're doing a lot of higher intensity training with race preparation and all of this type of thing, the reality is that you have lost a lot of volume, and you've lost a lot of the opportunity for steady state training that you might have been doing, for instance, in winter. And on top of that, you've got travel, you've got the impact of regattas. You might be in the sun all day for 8 or 10 hours, and that has an impact on your body. It has an impact on your body's ability to recover, to be able to adapt to training, because even though it's not coming from training, the impact of that still takes energy and resources of your body to be able to recover from. In winter, on the other hand, that script is basically flipped, because you finally actually have the consistency without events, with no tapering, no interruptions, and no big fatigue spikes where you might have really summer training camps and things like that. You don't have any of those elements that are going to impact your ability to train in a really sustainable and consistent way, which means you get to string together week after week after week of uninterrupted, high quality work. And that's where the magic can really happen. So physiologically, the body responds best to sustained sub-maximal stress. So not just being flogged all of the time. It responds best when you can do a large volume, or a relatively large volume, because not everyone's going to have the luxury of time, to develop the aerobic work, to build that base in a way that your body can continually recover from, which also gives you the opportunity to make meaningful improvement in the areas of strength training, to build muscle mass, but also to actually get physically stronger. So you're literally putting deposits into your physiological account that you get to then draw on for the whole rest of the year. And the reality that most rowers never really internalize is that your aerobic capacity, your base engine, actually changes quite slowly. You don't double its performance in a month. You build it in layers over time, and winter is essentially the point of the season where you actually have the bandwidth to do that. So the second reason I mentioned before was focus. So in winter, because you're not trying to prepare for a specific race, you're not chasing results. You're not thinking about what the split's going to be on the testing ergo next week. You're not worrying about a regatta schedule or seat racing or trying to make sure that you're in a particular crew. It frees you up to focus purely on training quality. So yes, I mean, in terms of quality, I mean things like technique and stuff like that, but that should be a given all year round. That's not really specific to it. What I mean is that you can take pressure off the output and focus, or on the result, and focus more on the process. So you can actually fix the issues that you might have, whether it's in your physiology or in your in your setup, so that you can address weaknesses and come out of the winter not just fitter, but actually stronger in the areas that potentially may have been preventing you from being as fast as you normally would or otherwise could be. So whereas when you try and change technique mid-season, you have all of these other elements that prevent you from being able to spend enough time working on the particular thing that is going to make the biggest difference. So the third thing I mentioned there as well was freedom. So what I mean by freedom is both mentally and physically. Winter is basically the one chance in the year to be able to step off that worrying about performance, step off that performance treadmill, for lack of a better phrase, and rebuild the training around you. So you can focus on your goals, on your recovery, because you're not having to get up and perform. If you need a deload, you can take a deload. You can add in high quality strength training. You can adjust your volume. You can focus on building durability instead of chasing performance, because doing all of these things in a consistent way is actually going to deliver a much better performance a bit later on. And particularly for masters athletes, you've got real lives, you've got jobs, you've got families, and in winter, all of those things are still there. But by removing that looming stress of racing, you actually get the opportunity to train in a more consistent way than when you're trying to fit in a regatta every weekend and things like that. So through physiology, focus, and freedom, this is the reason why winter training is the engine room of your entire season. So the way that we'll unpack this is with what I call the 3D training framework. So it's to diagnose, design, and deliver. So just before we jump into that, I just wanted to make sure that if people have jumped in a little bit late, we're going to be going through a couple of processes next. There are some links in the caption to these resources, so obviously don't go and look at them now, but you can refer back to them later. So if you want to go and find about some of the testing stuff that we're about to talk about, or the analysis tools, things like that, you're going to be able to find those in the caption. So feel free to jump in and grab those if you need to have a look at them. So before we jump into actually how you structure it, there's just one more myth I want to kind of try and break before we get into it. And it's the idea that your winter training should be only low intensity, steady state work. That obviously is a really important part of it. It's absolutely vital, and it's the foundation of your aerobic capacity. It absolutely deserves to have a big share of your winter training. But for a lot of rowers, it becomes the only thing that they do. And the idea that in winter, you're just going to do long, steady state, maybe a little bit of strength work on the side. But that's where the opportunity actually gets lost. Because what I mentioned earlier is that this is your opportunity to target some of the specific weaknesses that you may have present in your physiology that you haven't had the chance to direct enough attention to. So the purpose of winter training is not just to accumulate volume, it's to actually create an adaptation. It's to cause your body to change in the way that we want it to, which is a performance adaptation. And that only happens if you target the specific system with enough work to actually get the adaptation and then have the recovery from it. So for a lot of rowers, yes, endurance is a critical thing that they need to be working on all the time, but they may be underdeveloped in another area. So for instance, there's an athlete that I work with who, when we first started working together, he had been trying to break 6 minutes on the erg for about 2 years. And in that time, he'd come out of a US college program, very, very strong, very well-developed aerobic base. He could deadlift over 200 kilos. And his initial perspective was that his inability to break 6 minutes was because he didn't have enough endurance. And so when we did this initial testing that we're going to talk about, what we actually revealed was that his bottleneck was in peak power. And by allocating, we spent about 8 weeks targeting it all up in a really direct way. And he went from a 608 down to a 557 in 11 seconds in 8 weeks. Now, that wasn't because that training was some sort of magic wand or was particularly special, but it was because it was addressing the specific area that he had a big deficiency in. And because it's a neuromuscular adaptation, so it's to do with the brain's ability to send the signal through the nervous system to tell all of the muscle fibers to engage at once, you're going to get a really quick response from that. So you're not necessarily going to see that level of improvement in all cases. Obviously, your mileage may vary, and it depends on you and your age and your training background and all these kind of things. But it's what's possible even to people at the pointy end if they have an area that's deficient. So to give an example as well for you potentially individually, if you've just spent 2 or 3 months training and racing head races, you've been spending a lot of time doing threshold training. You've been spending a lot of time probably working at that sort of 85% of your maximum heart rate, rates up to about 28, probably 20, maybe up to 30, depending on the boat class, as well as long pieces with low rates and lots of kilometers. The question to ask yourself, or that I'm posing to you, is when was the last time you did proper power, either anaerobic or peak power? Short, really high intensity sessions that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable, probably months ago, probably back in racing season, which means that your top end speed, which relates to your ability to accelerate the boat or the erg, your ability to change gears has started to fade. And if it is a weak area for you, which it is for around 40% of the rowers that I see the testing results of, then you're just neglecting the area that is actually the biggest hold on your performance. So to use the example of that sculler I was talking about earlier, he had been working for 2 years to try and get under 6 minutes and hadn't really made any gains because he was severely limited in one area that he'd been completely ignoring. So yeah, that's why it's important to be able to actually know what it is that you're going to target. So I mentioned earlier having freedom. So because you're not preparing for any particular event, you can actually focus on those things and do them to a really high standard. So doing that high intensity stuff, though, doesn't mean that you're throwing out the aerobic work. It should still be probably about 70 to 80% of your total volume. The difference is that rather than targeting the event specific stuff you might have been doing in the run up to head racing, you're going to target your specific weaknesses. So you should be including 1 to 2 focused sessions per week, which are going to be a higher intensity or a harder session that is specifically focused on whatever is your identified bottleneck. So let's talk about how we would actually go about doing that. So before you start adding in sessions, before you start throwing lots of intensity and thinking, oh, I'm going to go and do peak power, it may be right for you, but may not. The first step is probably also the most important. And that is also the step that most people just skip. And that's that you actually have to diagnose where you are right now. So the first step in being able to make your training effective is not to guess, but to measure. Because if you don't know where you're starting from, then you can't tell whether the work you're doing is actually working or whether it's targeting the right things. So often people will go by feel, I think I'm getting fitter or I felt strong this week. And that's fine in the short term. And maybe it's going to help you know when you need deloads and that type of thing. But you should be using this time to collect data. So where I would always start is with the simple testing. And what you want to assess is your peak power, your anaerobic capacity, and your aerobic endurance. So I have a link in the caption for this exact testing framework. It's what I use with all of the rowers that I work with, and I really recommend it for everyone outside of high performance rowing, where they've probably got extra layers of support and sports scientists and lab testing and all that sort of stuff that's going to give them even more information. But what you can do with these 3 tests is basically create the framework for all of the training that you need to do. So it takes less than 35 minutes to do all the tests, although I do recommend a little bit of rest in between them, particularly between the anaerobic capacity and the endurance test. But the link also has a tool where you can put your results into a spreadsheet, and it's going to tell you what your bottleneck is. So the first thing you're testing is peak power. So this is your anaerobic ATP PC system. It's basically a reflection of your maximum possible output. This is what sets the ceiling on your performance, and basically, no matter how fit you are, you can never exceed your maximum power. Your maximum is your maximum. The bigger it is, so let's say we go back a step. Let's say that hypothetically, during a 2,000 meter race or 2,000 meter ergo, you operate at approximately 50% of your max watts. If your max watts is bigger, 50% is now a bigger raw number as well. So this is where even sometimes training peak power, if it's deficient, can actually lead performance in aerobic, or 2K is considered to be about 80% aerobic. Can even lead performance in aerobic based activities as well. So the test that I use is a 7-stroke max. Basically, all you need to do is set the screen to display watts, start from a stationary start and row full rate, full length, full power for 7 strokes with the watching the screen, and simply record the biggest number that you see on any one of those strokes, which is normally going to be the 7th stroke. You have to be pretty unusual to get it earlier than that, but not impossible. The second test that you're going to do is to test your anaerobic lactic system. So this is what we use to produce energy from after the first 10 to 15 seconds up to, it's still very prominent up to 2 minutes, but it's definitely the primary source of energy up to about 60 seconds. And so it plays a really big role in racing, generally considered to be about 20% of the energy output in 2K racing, and estimated anywhere up to maybe 40% in 1K. That's the high end of the estimates that I've seen. It's very difficult to ascertain exactly what percentage it is, and it's going to vary by the individual as well. But it does play a really big role in racing. So the test we would do for this is a 60-second max. Again, start from stationary with the screen set to display watts, row as hard and as fast as possible for 60 seconds, record the average watts from that piece. You can do this test after about a 5-minute rest from the first test, so you can do them in the same session. I do recommend a rest from this one to the next test, but if you have to do them on the same day, if you can give yourself 2 hours, or at least, I would do no less than 40 minutes. But if you can give yourself 2 hours plus, then you're probably going to be fine to do them a bit closer together or on the same day. So for this test, is to assess your aerobic endurance, which basically is your maximum sustainable effort is what we're assessing. So it does encompass the low intensity work when we talk about your aerobic system, but this test is more focused, I guess, on the harder sustained work. And I like to use a 30-minute rate 20. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is that it's a pretty common test that most people have done at some point in school or club rowing. They may have already done it recently, which means that they don't have to do an extra test, which is always nice. And it's actually a great training session in its own right. It's effectively an anaerobic threshold session, really good quality training. And so it gives us good information about your aerobic system. It gives us good information about your anaerobic threshold and is good training. So it's a great one to include anyway. Again, just record the average watts so that we can use that in that tool that, again, there's a link for in the caption. So once you've done these tests, you can input those results into that analysis tool. It's going to tell you what your bottleneck is. And from there, you can start to allocate your sessions. So once you know what your bottleneck is, you can start to build your winter training plan around fixing that specifically. So what we're going to do now that we have your testing results is we're going to create a personalized blueprint for your winter training. So, and as a rower, that's really important because your physiology, your schedule, your goals, and your recovery are going to look different to someone else's. So following a preset program that is the same for everyone is, by its nature, is going to pick winners and losers. So if you're following that, you might be lucky, you might be one of the selected winners, or it might be that you do lots of really hard work and don't really see as much improvement as you would like to because you're not targeting the things that are going to make the biggest difference to you. So if you can train based on your own data, even if we're just using this simple framework that is really effective, you're going to see more progress in the 12 weeks of winter than most people are going to get in 12 months of trying to guess their way through it. And to go back to that earlier example, in 8 weeks, we were able to help that gentleman take 11 seconds off his time, whereas he had been stuck at about that point for 2 years. I think his PR at that point was 6:05. So he was slightly slower than that when we started. So I guess even if you say 8 seconds from his PR in 8 weeks, that's someone who was already close to that 6-minute mark. So everyone's obviously, your mileage is going to vary, but with the athletes that I work with, generally in the first 12 weeks, unless they're at a really low base or a really high base, the average is about 4 split points over the first 12 weeks. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of what's possible when you really focus on specific targets. So diagnose first, then you're able to design something that is accurate and specific. And that's what brings us to the next step in the framework, which is the second D, which is design, how to actually build a program that's going to work for you. So before we jump into that, we just got a question in the chat, which we'll just answer quickly. So when considering your own winter program, is it less important to know your racing season ahead, but more important to look at you as an individual and work with a generalist approach for winter? So I would say over the winter, it's, unless you are in an environment where you are doing head races all through the winter, which I appreciate for people in the UK may very well be the case. But for most of the world, head racing tends to finish by the end of November. I would definitely, over that time period, what I'm suggesting you do is that you take the approach of developing your specific characteristics, or developing your bottlenecks, because that's going to allow you to come out of winter in the best possible position. It may not, now, if you're racing a really important head race in the middle of that winter block, you're probably not doing the best possible preparation for that event because you're trying to do what is best for developing you as an athlete in the context of the season. And that's where there's actually an important consideration with programming, which is that you have to start with your priority. And priority comes from the Latin meaning before all else. So you can't have multiple priorities. You can't have 4 priorities. You can only have 1. And so if that head race in the middle of your winter season is your priority for the season, then you should be preparing for that. But if it's not, if your priority is in the spring or in the summer, then you should look to do this training that is helping you to develop as an athlete so that you can best perform when it comes time for that priority event. When doing the testing, peak power or 30-minute rate 20, how many times should you do them to learn how to better perform the test to get actual results? Great question. With the peak power testing, I recommend that you do it at least 3 times. You can, with about a 3-minute rest in between each. So the 7-stroke test is very much non-fatiguing. You can do it over and over for a while without seeing a noticeable decline in performance within that session. So I would suggest there's probably going to be a learning effect. I'd probably do it at least 3 times, probably up to 5. Beyond 5, you're probably going to find that you're not necessarily giving you a result that is different enough to change any of the results. Then what I would be focusing on is just getting to that 5. If you want to be really confident about it. And then you can have, again, a 5-minute rest, which is enough time to allow your body to replenish ATP and the phosphocreatine stores inside your muscles, which is what's used in the ATP PC system, which is then going to allow you to actually to replicate your maximum output again. So that 5 minutes rest from the last test until you start the 60-second. For the 30-minute and the 60-second, you will get better over time through training, sure. But the physical cost of it, you can't necessarily just keep repeating them. So if you try and do the 60-second over and back to back, you're probably not going to get better and better because your body's got excess lactate that's going to take time to clear out. Over time with training, you'll see improvement in those tests, which is going to be a combination of fitness improvement, but also the kind of the neuromuscular element of being able to do those types of things better. But that is still real improvement. So in the same way that when you lift weights and you might, let's say you squat 60 kilos this week and next week you can squat 65, you haven't gained the equivalent of 5 extra kilos lifting capacity of muscle. There is a neuromuscular element where your body has gotten better at recruiting the muscle fibers to be able to actually do that lift. And there's an element of that in the testing as well. But it is still a real improvement, and training it is still going to see you develop and get faster in those areas. All right, can I still succeed at rowing while being 184 centimeters tall? Yes, yes, you definitely can. Even for male athletes, there have been Olympic gold medalists who were in the 170s. So off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure it's Stephen Hawkins of the Hawkins-Anthony double that won the 1992 Olympic men's double scull. I think he was 177 centimeters tall. So yes, you definitely can succeed at 184. If during testing the athlete identifies that their mindset during the testing is a limiting factor, how do you approach that, e.g. a lack of confidence during the 30-minute rate 20? Okay, so this is a really good question as well. So with the specific example of the 30-minute rate 20, the way that I would be suggesting someone to do it is that first you just need to get a number on the score, on the board, and I would probably retest earlier for that athlete. I'd probably retest within 3 weeks rather than 6 to 8 weeks so that they can have some of that learning effect that was asked about earlier. And the way I would do it would be to start at the average pace of the previous one and look to improve by 1 second and split in the last 10 minutes. And doing this means that they're doing it at a pace that is slower than they would typically go off at, but is equivalent to the average of what they did, and can gradually over time get faster within that test, but also by doing it more regularly, they're going to get more practice. Like I said before, the 30-minute rate 20 is actually a great training session. It's a hard session, of course, but it's actually a really effective training session. So doing it multiple times with more frequency is not necessarily, is not a bad thing. So yeah, that would be my suggestion there. If my coach makes our program, how can I still personalize it? Well, it depends on the amount of flexibility that you have. So if your coach sets 6-7 sessions a week and that is what it is, then that's obviously going to be difficult to modify. But if your coach is setting you, is setting the water sessions and the erg sessions you have flexibility with, for instance, or that there's some sessions that are done together as a squad that have to be done in a particular way, and then the other sessions you have flexibility to do what is right for you, then that's obviously how you can personalize it. We'll get to the structure of it in the next little section. I think that's us kind of caught up. So yeah, so we might move on to that. So yes, once you've diagnosed where you are, you know what your bottleneck is, the next step is going to be to design training program around that constraint. Because the other mistake that people often make with winter training is trying to improve everything at once. So they think, okay, I know I need to, be consistent. I know that I need to have a large volume of aerobic work, but I also know that I shouldn't just do aerobic work. So I'm going to do, one day I'm going to do anaerobic threshold, and another day I'm going to do peak power, and maybe another day I'm going to do 2K specific stuff. And what happens is that you don't actually do enough of anything to improve in that area. So you don't end up improving in a meaningful way. You keep touching on things, so you're familiar with it, but you don't actually improve your fitness in the particular areas, whether it's in improving your anaerobic threshold or your anaerobic capacity or your peak power. So every rower has a bottleneck. And for some people, it's going to be more prominent. Some people, it's going to be less prominent, but it's still the system that is capping their overall performance. And the testing that we've just talked about is going to allow you to identify what that weak link is, and then we can try and match it all up together. So when you design a program on this basis, there are 2 parts. So the first is bottleneck training, which is the 1 to 2 sessions per week that should be at least 72 hours apart 48 hours if you're tight on time, or if you're a more operating at a higher level, maybe you're a college athlete, or you're an ex high performance athlete or just someone who's been training for a long time. Maybe you've come from another sport, your body can handle more recovery. Maybe you might do 3 sessions a week. But in general, for most people, 2 bottleneck training sessions is going to be sort of the sweet spot where people are able to sufficiently recover between them and are able to do them to the standard that actually then drives performance in those areas. Because one of the things that people often do wrong with bottleneck training is if they're fatigued, then they don't end up doing those sessions to a standard that is enough to drive performance improvements. The other type of training is your aerobic foundation work. So this is your low intensity UT2 steady state work that supports your recoveries, builds your overall fitness. Now, this can also include, particularly for women who are menopausal or postmenopausal, this can include a little bit more UT1. And that's because of hormonal changes which affect how the body processes or breaks down and processes fats, so the way it oxidizes fats using the aerobic system. And they can benefit from a higher proportion of UT1. UT1 often gets a really bad rap. It shouldn't. It's a great form of training. It's just a different form of training to UT2. And for younger athletes, male and female, and for male athletes to later in life, UT2 is generally going to be more effective in the context of also having these high intensity sessions. If you weren't doing any high intensity sessions, if you're just doing steady state, you should actually have a reasonably high volume of UT1 included in there as well. But that's kind of making it more complicated than it needs to be. What I'm recommending for the vast majority of rowers is to use this system, which is based around polarized training of the bottleneck training sessions 1 to 2 times per week, and the balance being made up of low intensity UT2 work. If you are a menopausal or postmenopausal female athlete, you would probably shift about 50% of that UT2 work into UT1. And that would be on a sessional goal basis. So, you'd still have a session that was all about UT2 and a session that was all about UT1, rather than trying to make sessions a hybrid, if that makes sense. So outside of this, everything else is secondary. These 2 types of training, and the problem most people have is they end up diluting their effort by random intensity, or they want to get a little bit of a particular type of training in that is not necessarily what is going to give them the most benefit. So start by building your week around those 2 anchors, your 1 to 2 bottleneck sessions, and then the balance of your rowing and erging being that low intensity steady state. So what is that going to look like? Well, if you're, again, using that analysis tool and the testing to identify where your bottleneck is, then what you want to try and do if your sessions are, or if your bottleneck is peak power, then the sessions that you're going to do are going to be short, maximal bursts. I like to use 7 strokes, again, from the testing, but because it allows you to effectively continue to update that testing result through training. But Ed McNeely, who is the strength and conditioning coach who kind of pioneered this type of training on the ergo, he recommended 10 seconds. If you're up at about rate 40, which you probably will be for this sort of a session, 7 strokes is, I think, it's either 9.6 or it's 10.2 seconds. I can't remember exactly which, but it's basically 10 seconds. So I like to use 7 strokes. And you want to have about 60-second rest after it. So 7 strokes on, 60 seconds off, and about 20 repetitions of it. So a total of 20 repetitions. Now, for these to be effective, you need to be hitting at least 90% of your tested peak power. If you are less than that for 2 consecutive efforts, stop. Have 5 minutes of complete rest. This is going to allow your body to replenish the ATP and the phosphocreatine in the muscles so that you can use that system properly, and then continue. You don't need to scratch the ones that you didn't hit the 90%. It's fine, but just go into the trying to hit that 90% or above. I recommend for it that you just aim to hit the max you possibly can on each repetition, and when that eventually falls below 90%, that's where you take the rest, rather than trying to. Some people almost try and game it by just hitting the 90%. It's far more effective to just keep trying to push it higher, because, as alluded to earlier, there is a learning effect. So because a big portion of this type of training is actually the improvements in neuromuscular function, so the ability of the brain to send a signal to the muscles to recruit all of the muscle fibers now to produce power, produce it rapidly, you're going to get as great a benefit, or actually a bigger benefit from that neuromuscular training than you are from the muscles themselves becoming stronger. You're not really building strength in that type of training. You're actually improving your body's ability to recruit all of the muscle fibers, as well as there's a certain amount of training your system to replenish the ATP piece that gets used up in the efforts. If your anaerobic capacity, so the 60-second test, if that is what shows up as your bottleneck, then you'll be wanting to work slightly longer pieces. 30 to 60 seconds is generally the best time frame to work on for anaerobic power at maximum effort. So these are probably the least enjoyable sessions in most people's experience, whereas the peak power training is actually quite fun. You get to put big numbers on the board, doesn't leave you sore, you don't walk away fatigued. It's actually quite an enjoyable way of training. Anaerobic capacity is probably a little bit less fun. It's more of what people typically think about with intervals. 30 to 60 seconds maximum effort with about a 6-to-1 work to rest ratio. So for instance, if you did 30 seconds on, you'd probably have about 3 minutes rest before the next one. If you worked for 60 seconds, you'd probably recommend about 6 minutes rest. So about that 6-to-1 ratio is about right. And then if your bottleneck was aerobic, then you're going to be wanting to include more of that threshold training through the winter. So this may have been what you were already doing as part of the preparation for head racing, but these are the sessions that are going to be pushing you to your upper limit of what your kind of maximum sustained output is. So this is things like, 3 or 4 by 2,000 meters at 22, 24, 26. It might be things where you're doing sessions based on 5K pace for a total of between 20 to 40 minutes of total working time. And the intervals could be anywhere from generally, sometimes they're as low as sort of 4-ish minutes. That's unusual. It can be part of it. Usually it's going to be between sort of 8 to 20 minutes per interval. Whichever it is, these become your key sections within your week. So whether it's peak power, anaerobic capacity, or your endurance, these become your key sessions. So these are the ones that should get your best attention, with the recovery allocated around them, so you can do them to a super high standard, and they should be at least 48 to 72 hours apart from one another. Everything else is that low intensity aerobic endurance that's going to support quality execution as well as allowing you to recover in between. So with setting those sessions, your total time, I'm a big advocate for UT2 training using heart rate, and that's because when you shift from UT2 into UT1 training, your body moves from primarily using fats as the fuel source to primarily using carbohydrate, and that's a different mechanism that your body goes through to break those down for energy. So they're still aerobic, but the mechanisms your body is using is actually quite different between glycolysis, which is how you break down carbohydrate, and fat oxidation. So I'm a big advocate for heart rate training to make sure you are in correct UT2 zone if that is the purpose of the session. Time in zone, between 40 to 80 minutes is what you're looking for. So if you are not very well trained, if you're newer to rowing, if you're just a less experienced athlete, you can see improvements in UT2 training even as short as 20 minutes, but that rapidly starts to drop off as you become fitter. So 40 to 80 minutes is kind of a good sweet spot. I like to use about 60 minutes for the vast majority of athletes because it's long enough to be able to see a meaningful improvement. It's still short enough to be both time efficient and mentally you can stay in it. I would prefer someone to be able to do 60 minutes on a regular basis rather than trying to do 90 minutes in zone in one go. There's also research around instances of lower back pain, and the primary predictors of lower back pain in rowers. Number one was a previous lower back injury. Kind of makes sense. The other one was continuous bouts on the ergo of greater than 40 minutes in a continuous go. So that's why I like to try and break it into maybe 3 by 20, 2 by 30, that type of thing. But the other one as well was total time on the erg, and crucially for people going into winter, a big increase in total volume all at once had a really high correlation with instances of lower back pain. So that's why I like around the 60-minute mark. It's quite sustainable on a year-round basis. it's going to give you really good results for the vast majority of people. Now, if you want to know what your training zone should be, there is also a link in the caption for a training zone calculator. Again, you can download that, and you pop in your maximum and your resting heart rates. It's going to tell you what your training zones are going to be. And if you've got a relatively recent 2K or 1K, it's also going to tell you what splits you are likely to be correct for each of those training zones for you. Now, just on that one, if you're using that, I would absolutely go by heart rate for UT2. These splits are usually pretty accurate, but there's a bit of a range with them for the UT2 because it's to do. I'm not going to go into really deep into the nitty gritty of how training zones are developed in this video. I have actually got another live video on YouTube if you do want to go and watch me talk about that and how training zones are developed. But it's essentially, if you are not yet efficient at the first lactic threshold, your UT2 splits will be slower than you think they should be. But if you stick to it, you will see a rapid improvement in your UT2 splits, which is then going to be having them reflect more in line with what you'd expect from the other sources or from the other training zones. So then what we want to try and do is fit that into a real week. So what does this look like for an average person who, let's say that they row 3 times during the week and a Saturday, and they erg 1 to 2 times a week, depending on their availability. Some people are going to be less, some people are more, but around that 5 to 6 session mark. So what you'd be looking at, I would be looking at for 3 weeks, doing 2 hard sessions, potentially on, say, a Monday and a Thursday, or a Tuesday and a Friday, or a Wednesday and a Saturday. So you've got that gap in between them. And then all of your other sessions being UT2. Now, if you were as I mentioned before, menopausal or perimenopausal, what you might look at doing might be, for instance, let's take a Monday, Thursday for the hard sessions, just for sake of argument. You might have rest day on a Sunday, hard session on a Monday, UT2 on the Tuesday, UT1 on the Wednesday, because it can actually be a really good preparation sort of session into your next hard session. Do your second bottleneck session on Thursday, and then UT2 on Friday and Saturday. So that'd be a 6-day-a-week program, and with a rest day on Sunday. That's how I would. That's the kind of thing I would do to structure it. But with that said, what I would look at doing as well is having a think about, if you are in a club environment, if you are rowing certain sessions in crew boats, or you've got a club erg day or something like that, where you're going to be doing stuff with everyone else, and you know that they're going to be hard sessions, I would make sure that you factor that in for your recovery. So you might still want to try and fit in 2 bottleneck sessions per week for yourself, but I would make sure that those sessions were 48 hours away from that hard session that you're going to do within a squad environment. So yeah, that's how I would take that sort of thing into account. So I wouldn't just ignore it. I would absolutely consider it as part of your overall load. So I mentioned you can do that for 3 weeks, and then on the 4th week would be a planned deload. So if you've been doing this throughout the period, you've been following these targeted sessions, then you're probably starting to accumulate a little bit of fatigue. What I would do is drop back to 1 bottleneck session for that week, and reduce the total duration of UT2 within that week. So let's say you had been doing 60 minutes. Maybe that week you're only going to look to do 40 minutes in zone. Maybe you spend more time doing technique. If you are lucky enough to be somewhere where you can continue to row through the winter. If you're on the erg, maybe you do a little bit of a shorter session. Maybe you spend a bit of, if you want to still use that time because it's what you've got allocated in your schedule, then maybe you're going to use it to do a bit more mobility. You're going to do a little bit more of those things that can sometimes be left by the wayside a little bit. So what isn't in that program? Well, there's no random sessions. There's no variety for its own sake, because when you design a session that you're trying to make really effective, or when you're designing a program that you want to be really effective, it's about being focused. It's about being deliberate and intentional. It's not about entertainment. Now, in a deload week, maybe that's a good time to include a little bit of variety, as long as the intensity is not high, because you are trying to recover. But that might be where, if you've got a novice boat that you go out with and help out as being a good club person, you go out and help some of the newer rowers learn. Maybe that's the time to include that session, because you're probably not getting a training benefit from it, but it can still be good for your enjoyment, for mental health, for encouraging new members within your club or within your program. So that's a good time to include those sorts of things. But overall, consistency rewards everything. So if there are sessions that are giving you real improvement, if you're doing sessions that are really focused and targeted and you're getting better as a result, then repeating them is a really good idea, because the more consistently you do it, the bigger the benefit's going to be. I mentioned, that monthly rhythm, 3 hard weeks, 1 easy week. That's going to give you a nice balance between accumulating fatigue. For most busy rowers, for most masters rowers, or people who are not in a high performance program, I find that rather than doing a kind of wave loading where you might go a medium, hard, light with the week structure, they're just doing 3 consistent weeks. Similar style that's called block periodization rather than wave periodization, I find works really well for most busy rowers, because it just means that it's a lot easier to schedule your routine. It's a lot easier to allocate, this is how much time I have for each session, and I can do that consistently, and then the deload week. By the 3rd week, you're going to be finding those sessions more difficult, and you're going to be feeling some of that fatigue. And that's where deloading is a really good idea to allow you to keep making progress. So 3 common traps that people fall into. Number 1 is, as I mentioned before, trying to train everything at once. You will never produce an overload, which is a good thing from the context of adaptation. You'll never produce an overload if you don't do enough of that thing to actually get an adaptation. So if you need to improve peak power, you can't do it once a week. You need to do it at least twice a week to actually get that improvement that you're looking for in a reasonable period of time. Second trap is ignoring recovery. So either putting the hard sessions too close together, or not deloading, or just generally beating yourself up all the time, just continually going. Very big advocate, even for reasonably high level athletes, of having a rest day every week. I think it's good for mental health. It's good to allow your body to recover. It's good to catch up on a little bit of sleep. And let's be real, for most people who have busy lives in other areas, there's probably going to be social interactions and events and things like that, having a day where you don't have to build your training around it, locked in each week, is good from a planning perspective, being able to organize your life. And then the third trap people fall into is just overcomplicating it. A perfect program that you don't follow gets you absolutely nowhere. Whereas a simple plan that targets the right types of things for you, even if it is repetitive, is going to get you a significantly better result. So don't try and make it too complicated. Do your testing, identify your bottleneck, 2 of those sessions per week, the rest of it low intensity training, do 3 hard weeks, and then have a week of deload. Keep it really simple, and so you can do it consistently and sustainably, and that you're going to come out of winter in a really, really strong position. So that's really the key to being able to do it, is doing something that you can consistently do. And if you can do it consistently, you're going to eliminate the constraint or the bottleneck that's actually been capping your overall performance. So now that you understand what that structure should look like, what a week should look like, the next step is then to actually deliver it. It's to do the doing. So this is the last section that I want to kind of go through on this particular topic. And we're going to talk about how to progress it, how to recover, how to adapt over time, so that you're not just training, you actually are seeing improvement. So that's what we're going to cover next. But before we do that, we do have a couple of questions that have come through. I just want to answer those. So commentary there. Finton McCarthy's 177 centimeters tall and is absolutely fire this season. Yeah, 100%. Michelle Seisha is 165 centimeters and likewise. So height is probably the most overrated thing in rowing. The reason why height is so valued is because if you are tall, you probably have long limbs, which means it is more likely that you are going to be able to row an effective arc at a longer stroke. A shorter athlete can still do that. There are things you can do to change the rigging of your boat. You can change the spreads and spans and inboards and all of these sorts of things to alter the angle, because when we row, it's not linear. It's not straight up and down. Whether it's sculling or sweep, you have a rotational angle. You're coming around a pin. So that means that if you can increase that angle by manipulating the lever arms, you can still row a stroke that is just as long as a taller athlete. The benefit of being tall is that you can then be in a more biomechanically efficient position when you're at length. A classic example of that at the moment is Ollie Zeidler. rows what appears to be 3/4 slide at the catch. Well, that's because he's actually, between his height and his arm span, he can still row an enormous arc. He can still get to, I think I saw somewhere he rows 68 degrees at the catch, which is huge, and do it from 3/4 slide, which means he's in a stronger position to push from. So that's an advantage. But then you look at the fact that he didn't win the world championship. So it definitely is or can be beneficial to be tall because of that ability to row a long arc in a more comfortable position. It is not the be all and end all. And I think it is vastly overrated as a determining factor in whether or not someone is fast. What's the risk with UT1, UT2 hybrids? Look, it's not so much a risk. It's just that when you spend enough time in a particular zone, so let's say you've got 60 minutes of workload time that you could train, and you try and split it between UT2 and UT1, you're just not getting enough stimulus within that session on one particular thing. So your body doesn't get enough of that overload and then that stimulus to adapt to the training that you put it under. Whereas when you do a UT2 session and then a UT1 session as separate sessions, you spend more time in that particular zone, more time using those particular mechanisms for the body to produce energy in that way, and it gets better and better at doing that. It gets more of a stimulus and then it adapts to that stimulus. So that's why I don't recommend having the sessions be hybrid sessions. What do you recommend to do differently than longer rowers on the water in the single and the double, and also on the erg as a smaller rower? Should I try to enlarge my stroke? So is this for sculling or sweep? So for sculling, what you generally want, you want an arc of between about 105 to 110 degrees total arc. So that's catch angle and finish angle. What I would do as a starting point is to work out what your finish angle is. So get yourself set up behind the pin through the work. So this is the distance behind the center line between the two pins. If you go, you can basically use simple trigonometry to basically draw a triangle and work out how far back you need to be if the inboards are the two sides of the triangle. So that's the distance from, if you're not sure what I mean by that, it's the distance from the button to the handle or to the end of the handle. That's your inboard. And so you can use that to determine what your finish angle should be, and then get that set and then see what your catch angle is. And if it's not long enough, then what I do is bring your spans in. So bring the pins in closer together, which is going to give you a greater angle at the catch. You make sure your inboards are still the same total length of the actual inboard. And that's going to mean that you still hold the same finish angle, but you can alter the catch angle to be able to row a longer stroke. I would also be thinking about, if you're a shorter rower, you do need to be strong in deep positions. So the strength training, which is one of the topics we're going to come to in a minute, you want to be doing a lot more work in deep positions. So things like box squats and step ups, where you're having to work from that deep position, which is going to mimic the position of the catch, because you will need to be stronger in those positions, relatively speaking, because you can't be in a more biomechanically efficient position like a taller rower can. You don't get that same luxury. So that's I guess that's the trade-off, But it's certainly not it is not, I want to be really clear, it is not the be all and end all. Okay, let's jump back in and move on to the next section. So this is where we're talking about how to actually design, you've designed your training program around your bottleneck, and this is where you actually have to do it. And this is where most rowers often lose their progress, not because the plan was wrong, but because they don't just stick to doing it on a consistent basis. So it's not about trying to train harder, but you do want to make sure that you're doing particularly the bottleneck sessions to the standard that is going to drive performance outcomes, and the low intensity work in the correct zones, so that your body is getting the adaptation you're looking for and is allowing you to recover enough to be able to do those hard sessions to the standard that's going to get those performance outcomes. So some of the things that people often kind of neglect as well is that you need to do that recovery. It will allow that recovery time between those hard sessions. So something I see occasionally is someone will miss a hard session, for instance, that life happens, and they go, cool, well, I'm going to move it 2 days later because I've got a time free there. You know, I normally have Sundays off. I'm going to do that session on Sunday now because instead of Thursday, to use our earlier example, and that way I'll still get it in this week. The problem is then they roll into the next week and they go Sunday to Monday, consecutive hard sessions, and they start to reduce the quality of those sessions because they're fatigued. So that's one of the common mistakes people make. If you miss a session, if you can't shuffle it by one day to still maintain basically the same rest and recovery periods, then sometimes it is better for it to just be a missed session. You didn't get to it this week. And sometimes that's just better overall rather than trying to play catch up. But with that said, consistency is the best thing. So as much as is reasonably achievable for you, you should be looking to be consistent with that schedule and continue to do it, in the correct order. So the kind of rules that I have to make the most out of your sessions is, number one, show up ready. So if you know you need more time to warm up, if it's earlier in the mornings, things like that, it's probably not the best thing to, I know people who live in Brisbane, which is where I spent my most of my years at uni. When we rode there, we rode at 4:45 in the morning, which was frankly obscene. And so if you needed to be on the water at 4:45 and you knew that you needed a longer warm up period, where do you get it? You can't start getting up at 3 every day because your body's just not going to get enough quality sleep to be able to manage it. So where reasonable, you should look at how much warm up do I need? Do I need to get on the water earlier? But you've also got to factor in some of those real life elements as well. But what I would definitely recommend is not skipping a warm up entirely. And if you don't have time before you get on the water to get more warm, you need to allow time on the water as part of your overall session to ensure that you even just that your heart rate can get up to the right zone. Because if you're doing UT2 and you get on the water cold and you go, let's go straight into the session, your body's going to probably spend the first 20 minutes of the workload getting the heart rate up to the right level. So you're not actually spending that time in zone. So warming up is really important. Second thing is be present. So when you're at training, train. If you're on the erg, try not to have your phone with you or things like that, because unless you're using it as a timer, and then I would be really strict on yourself just using the clock app to be able to do that. Make sure that, but what I generally recommend is actually using the interval function, even for UT2 stuff. If you're doing 3 by 20 minutes, use the interval function on the erg to set it up for 3 by 20 minute pieces with 2 minutes or 3 minutes rest in between, rather than using a timer. Because quality work comes from focus. It's very easy, especially these days, to get distracted on your phone. Maybe you see an amazing YouTube video by a particular Australian rowing coach, and you just have to watch it then and there. But you're better off watching it after the session, but still watch it. Rule number 3 that I have is make sure you execute with purpose. So before you go into the session, you should know what the sessional goal of it is. So even if it's a bottleneck session or if it's a aerobic session, you should know what is the adaptation. So is it UT2? Is it UT1? Whatever it is, know what it is that you're trying to do and make sure that you are deliberate in doing that type of training so that you get the sessional goal of the session. And then the fourth kind of rule that I have for making really effective sessions is stay within the margins. So what I mean by that is that you're not trying to go to failure every single time you train. Now, maybe anaerobic capacity is a little bit that way, but you're not trying to go to failure all the time. What you're actually trying to do is to finish with the idea of, kind of 1 rep in reserve. So the idea that, you haven't fully exhausted yourself every rep, because when you do that, it takes that little bit more time to recover, takes that little bit more out of you. Now, obviously, in the 3rd week of a cycle, maybe you're going to hit that failure, but it shouldn't be the goal every session, even in your hard sessions. And if it's UT2 training, you should finish it and feel like you could do another hour. That's really how it should be. So I'm a big believer in the idea of the minimal effective dose, which is that you always want to do the smallest unit of work that will still get you progress. Not less than that, because then you don't make progress, but the smallest unit of work that will still continue to see progress. All right. So one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is strength training. So that might be where we jump into next. Before I do that, I do want to take a second and just have a quick look at some of the other questions that came through. How can I train for a 2K race erg that is coming up in January as a novice rower with a very busy schedule? If it is a priority event and you need to be preparing for it, then you should be doing 2K specific work for it. If you're starting the preparation now, I would probably do that over the 4 weeks leading into it. So if you're starting now in October, I would follow this process that we've talked about through the first, until 4 weeks before, and I'd spend the last 4 weeks doing specific preparation for that event. There's a lot of questions on Instagram. Sorry, I missed those entirely. When I'm at the catch, I tend to spread my knees to be able to stretch more. So until I lose my belly, should I take a shorter stroke or work on not opening my legs? So what I would do is you can, if that's the case, you're probably going to have a little bit of splaying of the knees. I would drop your feet down, which is going to allow you to get more rotation from the hips, and that's going to give you more angle and allow you to still row a reasonably long stroke or a longer stroke. Do I have a better chance to be a good rower if I can run well? Maybe. I mean, there's a lot of people who are good runners who aren't good rowers for a variety of reasons. But yeah, that's there's not necessarily a correlation. It's not going to be a negative. If you're more aerobically fit, then that's always going to be a good thing. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily correlate in a direct way. How can you split up a rate capped 5K test? Obviously, can't build rating at the end. So for things like that, I'm a big advocate for do the first half at the average pace you completed the previous one at, and then if you have the capacity to, you can accelerate then in the second half. So negative splitting, I find, is a really good way to be able to structure a test so that you can continue to get faster over the course of it. Why do I use weakness-based training blocks instead of classic periodization, high to low volume, low to high intensity? I see yours a lot in rowing, but the other one in other sports. So the reason for that is because we're never stopping training aerobic base. We never stop developing that key aerobic element, even when you're doing weakness-based training. What can happen is if you have something that is a bottleneck, if it is a constraint on your performance, it can act as a brake on the entire system. In other sports, depending on their nature, they can be a little bit more specific. So they might be really, to use an example, like, road cycling is much more aerobic than rowing is because of the duration. It's a much longer race. Rowing sits in a slightly awkward place within the kind of makeup of endurance sports, in that it is a power endurance sport, and it probably has more in common with 800-meter running from an energy demands than almost any other sport. There's obviously a lot of crossover with other things. Cycling, because of the local muscular endurance in the legs, because of the high aerobic base required for competitive cycling. There's a lot of crossover. But the reason is that why is it different to other sports is because rowing sits in a weird space where you need to have a lot more. You need to have a lot more balance between all of those systems. Still, aerobic is going to be dominant, but if you have one particular bottleneck, it will act as a brake on the whole system. All right, I'll do one more, and then we'll go back to talking about strength. What if you can't keep your heart rate in the UT1 zone while working out? Does that mean you're pushing too hard? Essentially, yeah. So if you can't keep your heart rate in the right zone, then what it means is that you're not yet efficient at the aerobic. If you're talking about low intensity training, it means you're not yet efficient at the aerobic threshold that is related to that particular type of intensity. So if you're talking about UT2 training and your heart rate is too high relative to the split, it means you're not yet efficient at what's called lactate threshold 1 or LT1, which is where you are working using fats as the main fuel source and working aerobically. With UT1, if your heart rate's getting too high, what it probably means is that the pace is too high and you're having to use the lactic system to be able to kind of top up the amount of power that you need to hit those particular splits. So you actually are doing more work using the lactic system. So you end up in a little bit of a gray area with it. You're still going to be getting benefit from it for sure. It's not that the training isn't effective, but it's more of an involvement of the lactic system. And that obviously still has a big aerobic component as well. If you're doing it on a sustained basis, you're still going to be aerobic, because the aerobic system is the only system that can supply enough energy uh, for those longer durations of things. All right. So we might move on to talking about strength training now. So for for winter, one of the other opportunities that comes around when it comes to strength training is that you actually have, because you can set out your week and you can be consistent and you can structure things, you can actually make really good improvements in building strength in a way that you can't necessarily when you're in racing season. Again, because of the interruption of regattas along the way, and you might not want to have any muscle soreness before you race and things like that. Um, so because you have more control of your schedule, you can have a much more consistent and structured strength program. Now, I'm actually an advocate for training strength consistently and effectively all season long, but it is usually the first thing that the first thing to go when people get tight for time. But the reality is that rowing is a power endurance sport, and if you only work on one side of that equation, then you are missing the opportunity to be as fast as you could possibly be. And both sides of that, the endurance is obviously massively important, and is probably the single biggest individual system. But strength also is part of what sets the ceiling on how much force you can produce per stroke. Endurance determines how long you can maintain a certain percentage of that force. But if your ceiling is higher, then every aerobic stroke costs less effort as a percentage of your max to produce the same output. So being stronger makes a big difference. And to give you a personal anecdote, when I first went from high school rowing into club rowing as a lightweight, my first season, I got absolutely smashed. I was, back of the squad, with high performance squad, but I struggled to keep up with everyone. I made semi final in the single, um, and just generally struggled. Um, in the off season, it was the first time I did a proper strength program. I spent 6 or 7 months training strength properly, and when we kind of got back into consistent training as a squad, I was one of the fastest. And the only thing that had changed in that time was that I'd gotten really strong. But I did better on my low intensity splits. They were faster because it was a smaller percentage of my maximum effort to be able to produce that number. So strength is really valuable, and if you haven't developed it, if you haven't trained strength well in the past, you can see really big improvements over the course of 6 to 12 months. So that's not just limited to winter training. Um, I advocate for it all year long, but often it's the first thing that people give away. Now, this said, you don't need to be a powerlifter. You don't need to be able to squat 2 times your body weight and be above or beyond, like probably 1.3 times body weight. You're going to start to see some pretty severe diminishing returns in terms of how that increase in strength actually translates to boat speed. Um, and you don't want to train like a bodybuilder. You're not looking to train muscle groups. You should be looking to train movements, because that's one of the key things of being able to take um, general physical preparation, which is what we use to talk about, preparing athletes for performance. You want to train movements, because that's actually what's going to have the best transfer and in terms of building general proficiency. So the goal of the winter training generally for strength training is going to be to build, number one, durability. So I actually think this is the most important purpose of strength training, is that it allows you to handle the workload of more volume, more intensity, etc., because your body is more robust and less prone to injury. One of my favorite quotes is that the best form of ability is availability. And that's a big part of what strength and conditioning should be for. The other areas, obviously, is to become more powerful, or become stronger and more powerful, but also to become more mobile. So a lot of strength training is actually going to help improve your range of motion, because of the extra resistances. It can actually force you to go through a greater range of motion and become strong in some of those areas that you're weak. Because mobility is not flexibility. Mobility is not the length of your muscle, which is what flexibility and static stretching is about. Mobility is your capacity to move through a range of motion around a joint. And being stronger allows you to move through a range of motion around a joint more effectively. So strength training is really, really good for developing mobility as well. So what I recommend for most people, and there's going to be exceptions, but for most people, 2 sessions per week is going to be the sweet spot. So this is enough for you to be able to make progress. It's not so much that it's going to eat into your capacity to still target your bottlenecks and build good aerobic capacity if you're short on time. And if you're coming from a lower base, that's going to be heaps of stimulus. And if you're coming from a higher base, then you potentially already starting to approach the levels of diminishing returns. But more importantly, you are still going to be able to hit squat movement, a deadlift movement, as well as pulls and presses, at least twice a week. So compared to, for instance, 4 sessions per week with an upper-lower split, which I think is, for most rowers, is a really unnecessary use of time. Because in those sessions, you don't end up, in those sessions, the idea of having a dedicated upper or lower session is so that you can overload that particular set of muscles. But you then only get to train it twice a week anyway. You are going to be sorer, which is then going to impact on your other training sessions. And you actually don't need a dedicated lower body session to build lower body strength unless you are quite an advanced lifter. So if you do a full body session, you could do the same amount of meaningful work for yourself in 2 sessions, not be as sore, so you're less impacted on your other training, and you've only had to use 2 sessions. So you've saved, if you're busy, if you're short on time, full body training is absolutely the way to go. And for most athletes, that's going to be the most effective, because we're also focusing, as I said before, on movements. So if you do a squat, some people would say, oh, it's a lower body exercise, or it is a quad exercise, or it's a glute exercise. It is a squat exercise. You are getting better at the movement of the squat, which is knee extension and hip extension. As an athlete, that is the thing you're actually developing. You're developing better knee extension and hip extension, which is relevant in a rowing context because that's exactly what you do through the drive phase. From the catch position, you have knee extension and then you have hip extension. So that's why focusing on movement is to me is the key thing with constructing sessions. In my mind, every session should have 2 parts, sometimes a third, but always have 2 parts. So one is movement mechanics. So this is where you'd include your injury prehab, some stuff that's going to help you to be able to activate muscles that are, maybe you're not good at activating or not good at firing. It's going to help prime you for your main lifts that you do in the session. And it's going to allow you to work a bit on stability and things like that as well. This then acts as the warm-up. So you can spend 5 minutes or so on a bike or treadmill or erg to get your heart rate up a little bit, but then go straight into movement mechanics. So generally, these are things that are going to be around glute activation, anti-rotation, so things like a pail-off press, or if you don't have any equipment, a side plank with a reach through would be an anti-rotational exercise. It's going to be exercises that help you with breathing and bracing, like dead bugs and bird dogs. It's going to be things that are going to help you with scapular positioning. So you might do scap push-ups or scap pull-ups or scap inverted rows, things like that. They're going to help you with that shoulder positioning and activation of the muscles around the shoulder capsule. And then the second section is strength. Second section is going to be strength. So this is the part where you're going to do your primary lifts. And as I said, I would focus on movement patterns. So squat movement, hinge movement, pull, press, and then probably a unilateral movement. So an example session might be something really simple like a back squat. That's your squat movement. A dumbbell incline bench press. That's your pressing movement. A pull-up. That's your pulling movement. A Romanian deadlift. That's your hinge movement. And then you might do on one day, you might do a split squat. So you've got an extra lower body, but it's a unilateral lower body. And on the other day, you might have a dumbbell one-arm row. So again, unilateral movement. So there's a little bit of body balance going on there, but is still focused around getting your core movements in. But this whole thing, that's very simple. It's very focused. It's very repeatable. The way that I would manage progression is, so what I'm a big fan of is that your first week you do a little bit less sets or sets and reps. So classic example of, let's say that a classic program is like a 3x10. Week 1, you might do 2x10. This allows you to learn any new movements that you've got in the program. Week 2, you go to 3x10. So the progressive overload is adding a set. So you've increased the total volume. And then week 3, you might then go to 3x8. So you reduce the total volume. But when you do that, you increase the weight a little bit. So you still overload it. You still progress it with the weight increase. Then week 4, you'd go still 3x8, but you might increase the weight a little bit further. Then you'd move to your next program, your next 4-week program. And when you do that, week 1 effectively acts as the deload again, because you're going to have one less set of what the majority of the program looks like. And then that process can repeat. So during the winter, let's say you've got 12 weeks as a ideal kind of scenario. You're going to literally the season of winter, you've got December, January, February. Then what I would recommend for most athletes, is that your first phase is an adaptation phase. So it's going to be 8 to 10 reps or 8 to 12 reps, kind of hypertrophy sort of focus, 5 to 6 strength exercises that are, again, focused around those movement patterns. Then for 4 weeks. Next 4 weeks is a general strength program. So you're going to probably do the same exercises, but drop the sets and reps down to 6 reps, say, in 2 by 6, 3 by 6, 3 by 4, 3 by 4, instead of the 10s down to the 8s from that previous example. And you're going to increase the weight. So that's going to be more of a strength focus for the next 4 weeks. Then you're going to go back to a hypertrophy phase, or you're going to do another general strength phase, depending on sort of where you are and what your main goals are. I find that type of a process where you alternate between a phase of hypertrophy and a phase of general strength is something you can handle really well with the type of winter volume that you're going to be doing, and is going to help you to make really good progress. Because when you do hypertrophy, maybe you do gain a little bit of lean muscle, then you turn it into strength by training strength. If you're then stronger, you can lift a little bit more weight when you go back into a hypertrophy phase, which means that you're going to be able to get more stimulus and kind of keep that momentum and keep that making progress. The best way to fit it into your week is if you're doing double sessions, so you're doing rowing, say 6 days a week, and you're lifting twice a week, then I would do it on UT2 days, and I would do it the day after your key session. So to go back to our original example where it was Monday and Thursday, I would lift on Tuesday and Friday. That's how I would structure it, so that you always leave at least one clear day between strength and between your high intensity efforts, and you're not doing strength the day before. So you can do high intensity then into strength. That's completely fine, particularly for the level that most people are going to be at. But preferable to do it that way rather than the other way around, because you want to try and protect those key sessions as much as possible, so you can do them really, really well. But basically, the goal is to cooperate between the strength and the rowing, not to try and compete. If you are just rowing and erging, say 4 days a week, and you've got 2 strength sessions in there as well, then what I would recommend is you just slot them in the same way. So you might put them in the day after hard session, or if you've got the flexibility to do it on that previous example, you might do, Tuesday and Saturday, for instance. So that might seem like a bigger gap in the middle of the week, but you've got to remember as well that it's then a shorter gap at the other. It's still Sunday, Monday, so you still have 2 days in between at the other end as well. So the 3 big mistakes people make, number 1 is they try and turn it into bodybuilding. They think about, I need to hit this muscle and this muscle and this muscle and this muscle, and they end up spending, okay, well, rowing, the pulling movement, or when I pull through, I'm using my biceps. Got to get those curls in. Curls are great. Everyone loves doing them, or most people love doing them. But from a performance perspective, it's actually pretty limited. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do them, because if they make you feel good and they fit inside your schedule and fit inside your timing and make your training more enjoyable, then that's great. But it's not a requirement, and the performance impact is relatively limited, unless you're starting to get to a higher level. Train movements instead. Squat movements, hinge movements, pushes, pulls, unilateral movements. I'm also quite a big fan of carries. So things like farmers walks and stuff like that builds grip strength, core stability, or core strength, not stability, core strength. You've got to resist the urge for it to pull you over. So there's a little bit of strengthening through the glutes and lower back as well. It's and generally it's going to give you a good overall system training. So it trains the whole system. It's really good exercise. The second mistake is people just going too heavy too soon. If you're not used to weights, you haven't been doing it consistently, you think, I'm into winter, right, into the weights, and you try and go to failure from the beginning, then number 1, if you haven't done weights for a while, you are going to hurt really, really badly, and potentially spend 4 or 5 days where you can barely walk, and it impacts your training, and you don't want to go back to the gym because it really hurt. So if you haven't been to the gym for a while because you've just been rowing, reintroduce it slowly. Do it very light to begin with, like the first week, both 2 sessions, very, very light. Expect to be sore. Deal with it. It'll go away. But if you don't overload it in those sessions, the soreness will pass much faster. The other thing is that you actually want to build strength over time. So you don't need to be going to failure. 1 to 2 reps in reserve is really the ideal amount. That's going to allow you to get enough of a stimulus to continue to make improvement, but you're going to be able to recover from it really well. You're going to have a little bit of soreness, but not tons of soreness the next day, so you can still train properly in all of your other sessions. And then the other mistake people make, which is kind of linked to the same thing, is focusing on weight and not movement. So when let's use a squat as an example, you're going to get far more benefit for rowing from getting into a full 90-degree squat and then controlling the movement in the bottom part and controlling the movement back out than you are by putting an extra 20 kilos on and doing a shallow squat where you don't have control of the movement. So one of the easiest ways you can make strength training more difficult in a positive way, if you don't have a lot of weight, is to increase the tempo. So you might be able to squat quite a lot, but if I got you to do a bodyweight squat and I told you had to take 5 seconds down, pause for 5 seconds at the bottom, and then take 5 seconds to get back up, you'd probably find it pretty challenging, even just with body weight. You can take that same principle to any kind of exercise. If you increase the tempo, you will increase the amount of tension on the muscle and the amount of work that you have to do, make it more challenging without making it heavier. This is really good for masters athletes because you can get more stimulus safely, and it's also really good for less experienced lifters in general. So maybe junior athletes who are looking to build some strength but aren't necessarily really confident with putting a lot of weight on a bar and lifting it yet. That can be another way of still getting great stimulus, but making it a little bit safer and a little bit less intimidating as well. So to recap, strength work is really important because it raises the ceiling of your overall performance. It requires less of a percentage of your maximum force per stroke to be able to get your desired outcomes. And when it's done well, it should support your rowing, build robustness, as well as other general physical qualities like strength, power, and mobility. The general rule with strength training across all sports is that you're not trying to make it sport specific. You shouldn't be trying to make your weights a replica of your rowing sessions, because if you were, you should just do more rowing or more erging, because you're going to get a more specific transfer from doing that. The purpose of strength training is to develop those general physical qualities like robustness, strength, power, mobility, and then to transfer it into a sport-specific context by doing your rowing. So if you get really, really strong and then you do lots of rowing, you're going to be stronger when you row. If you try and make the weights a replica of 2K racing, you want to do 220 squats because that's how many squats you're going to do or how many leg drives you're going to have in a race, then the load required to do that is going to be so low that you don't actually get a stimulus. You might still get sore, but you're not actually improving your strength at all. So let's try and pull this all together now, because I appreciate it's probably gone on a little bit longer than I'd originally intended. But just to summarize, as I said right at the beginning, races are not won in the spring or in the summer. That's where they get claimed. Where they're actually won is in this period of time that we're about to come into, the winter. This is the most important training block of the season from an overall performance perspective, because it is a little bit quieter, because there is less disruption, sometimes because you might be left on your own devices a little bit more. But it's a time where you can just put in some really consistent work, get some really good quality stuff done, focus on the things that are going to make the biggest difference to you so that you can come out of it in the best possible position to be able to accelerate into your racing season. So with everything that we've talked about today, it's about making sure that it's not about adding more work, it's not about adding more sessions, but it is about trying to take the amount of work you're already doing or the number of sessions you're already doing and make that work more effective so that you can get the most out of your winter season and be able to go as fast as possible when it comes to racing. If that sounds like something that you'd like some help with, then you're welcome to have a look, either DM me, or there will be a link in the caption on YouTube if you want to have a look at my coaching programs. But otherwise, this information is something that you can take and put directly into your own planning to actually build out a program that is specific for you in a really simple way. Do the testing, identify your bottleneck, build your training program around the bottleneck, supported by aerobic work, 2 strength training sessions per week, 3 hard weeks, and then a deload. It's a relatively simple formula. It's a cycle you can repeat. Diagnose it, design it, deliver it. And then I guess in that 3D system, the other D I didn't mention is just to do it again over the duration of the time. Simple, it's powerful. And the reality is that almost nobody actually does it properly because people get distracted by other things. People get distracted by sessions that they have heard about that they just want to give a try, even though it doesn't fit into their training, even though it's maybe not relevant to them. So most people don't actually do the simple things that they know will help them to go faster. So if you can focus on doing those things really well, you're going to get more out of your winter training and you're going to be a faster rower as a result of it. So what I want you to do after this, not necessarily immediately after, because it's about 11:30 p.m. So if you're in Australia, it's probably not the best time to do it. But if you've not already, grab the testing framework. If you're on Instagram or Facebook, DM me the word testing and I will send it across to you. If you're on YouTube, it is in the caption. Go and run the 3 tests, the 7-stroke, the 60-second, and 30-minute rate 20. Put your results into the energy systems analysis. Find your bottleneck, build your plan around it, add in the strength training, run that plan for 4 to 8 weeks, track your progress along the way, then retest. And if necessary, your bottleneck may actually change because you may have done enough to actually elicit improvement in that area. That's it. That's the system. It's not fancy, it's not complicated, but it has worked for me for nearly 20 years with more than 1,300 rowers, and it keeps working. So what we might do now is I'll go through the chat and just see those. I saw there was some more questions that came in. I'll answer those questions and then that'll be the end of it. So if you do have any questions that have come up, drop them in the chat now, and I'll answer them all before I jump off. So, if you could only train twice a week to maximize your performance, what would you train? What would your training program look like? How would you? Okay, if you could only train twice a week total, then all of this advice that I've spoken about is not actually relevant to you. You need to be able to train. The bare minimum would be 3 times a week to be able to apply this sort of a system. If you're only training twice a week, I would probably row. I would do 2 hard sessions. I'd probably do a HIIT-based program. I'd do them 72 hours apart, and that's probably going to be your best bang for your buck. If you've only got 2 sessions, it's probably what's going to give you the most improvement. The reality is that this system is not really applicable at only 2 sessions a week. If, on the other hand, you have 2 sessions a week to allocate, plus you're doing training in another program, and you've just got 2 sessions you can personalize, what I would do is look at how many hard sessions you're doing in your existing program, and if your recovery can support it, then I would look to include bottleneck sessions. And if you're already doing lots of hard sessions, then you probably actually need more UT2. So that's what I would include. So if you only had 2 sessions a week, that's how I would incorporate it. All right. How can I know if I'm explosive or endurance type athlete in rowing? Do the testing. So as I said, if you're here on Instagram, DM me the word testing. I will, when I get the chance, probably tomorrow my time, I will send you a link to it. Otherwise, I had a post up yesterday about peak power training, but the call to action to that was to comment testing. So if you comment testing on that post, you'll get sent the testing framework. But you do the testing, put that in to the analysis, and it'll tell you what type of athlete you are and where your bottleneck is. Is there a way to watch this video again? Yes, this is going to be put up on YouTube, so you'll be able to go back and refer to it whenever you need to or whenever you would like to. I can't see the captions. Can these be DM'd to me? If you, yeah, look, I'll try and remember that username. I'll just to be honest, Nicolede, just send me a DM for comment the word testing. I'll send it to you, and then that can be a reminder to send you any of the others as well. When would you reassess your baseline numbers for each test? So every 4 to 8 weeks. Basically, if you're doing peak power training, then so let's say your bottleneck was peak power, so you're doing those 20 by 7-stroke max efforts. Part of the reason I like the 7-stroke max is you're literally doing the same test. So over that 4 weeks, you just record your data. You don't even need to retest. You can just basically treat your best number there as your result for that test, and then that's going to show you whether or not you've improved in that area and whether you've addressed that bottleneck. In which case, then I would look at doing the whatever the next bottleneck was for the next block. Or if they were similar, like let's say your peak power was the slowest and your lactic and your aerobic systems were pretty similar, I would redo the tests at the beginning of week 5 and then go from there. If you've been doing aerobic training, I would, as your bottleneck, I would probably wait 6 to 8 weeks before retesting. When building stamina, is it better to opt for ergo or water sessions? So if you can stomach it, the ergo is going to be more efficient from a purely physical response perspective, because uh, not because it is inherently that the training you get from it is better or anything like that, but because it is so much more time efficient. Because if you need to go and do an hour of UT2 and you go down to the water to do it, you've got to, let's say you've either way you've got to travel to the same location. Let's say you're over at the boathouse, but you've got to factor in travel. Then you've got to get your oars out. Then you've got to get a boat out. Then you've got a boat. Then you've got to get out there. Then you've got to find a good stretch. You've got to potentially avoid other river users. You've got to do all of these things that are going to take away from your ability to do the hour consistently. And then at the other end, you've got to come in. You've got to get the boat off. You've got to get the oars out. You've got to wash the boat. You've got to put it all away. To get 60 minutes of work done might take you 2 hours. If you're on the ergo, you can just do 60 minutes. So from a practical perspective, if you're just looking at building stamina, the ergo is going to be better because it's just more time efficient. If time is not an issue for you, then you're probably going to enjoy the water more, and the difference is non-existent. There, I would probably think about what is the most important thing when you come out of winter. Like, do you go straight into an erg test, or you go straight into on-water racing? And whichever is the answer to that is where I would what I would opt for doing that your stamina work. If you have questions, oh, sorry, that's someone just letting people know. Thank you for letting people know. How much steady per day do you think is too much? When do you get to junk volume? Well, it really depends on how well trained you are. So for the vast majority of athletes, up to and including high school athletes who are looking to get recruited to colleges, or masters athletes who compete at the pointy end of world masters or head of the Charles or things like that, the absolute upper limit, and I'd probably be leaning more to this on the water just because of it's going to start to get a little bit sore joints and things. The absolute upper limit would be about 100 minutes. Most people, 40 to 80 minutes is going to be plenty. So of time actually in zone when it comes to steady state. So that's not including warm up and so forth. How can I be effective with 3 sessions in the winter? So what I was saying before, if you've got 3 sessions, then what I would do is I would operate on a fortnightly basis for a 6-week block rather than for a 7-week block rather than a 4-week block. So first week I would do 2 bottleneck sessions and 1 aerobic. The next week I would do 2 aerobic and 1 bottleneck. So I'd look at it as a 2-week cycle, do 3 2-week cycles, so 6 weeks, and then a deload week. You may not need a deload week if you're only training 3 times a week, but you just sort of have to see how your body actually responds. Will this be recorded to watch? Yep, this is going to be live on. This has been live on YouTube, and you're going to be able to access it on YouTube. I will post a link to it in my story tomorrow, so that people can access the video. And if you did register for notifications when I go live, you're also going to be emailed a link to that as well. Does that 100 minutes limit still apply split into 2 sessions in one day? No, and that's actually a really, really good point, Eli R. Wells. If you can if you have the capacity in your schedule, maybe you're on holidays or it's the weekend or whatever, if you can do like 2 50-minute sessions or 2 60-minute sessions rather than 1 100 or 120-minute session, that is going to be better for you, because the actual act of your body warming up, cooling down, you are going to be able to. There's an increased cost for the body to be able to do that. So it does actually require energy. It still is eliciting a stimulus on that energy system, and then you're going to be able to fully replenish. You're going to be able to eat in between sessions, replace the glycogen that you've lost. Because when you do long aerobic work, eventually your body's going to start to burn up the stored glycogen that you have in your body. That's why cyclists have gels and things like that to keep topping it up. Because when you start to get glycogen depletion, it's not like running out of gas in the car. You can't just put the pump in, fill it full of gas, and then you're fully charged and ready to go. It's more like charging your phone. You plug it in, and it takes ages to get up to full charge. So it's more like that. If you run out of glycogen, you need to have more time. It's going to take you a long time to fully replenish it. So if you can keep 2 sessions and you split them up by 2+ hours, then you're actually going to get a better overall response from that, and your body's going to handle it better. So yeah, really great question. I think I'll just go back to talk because I wasn't checking comments on Instagram at the beginning, so I'll just quickly have a look. What about mindset? How would you motivate athletes to battle mental fatigue, especially if someone dislikes winter training? So the first thing I'd ask there is, what do you mean by dislikes winter training? Do you know, if you mean that they don't like doing long ergs, then number one is you can break it up into smaller chunks so that they can learn to do low intensity training over over a longer period of time. So one of the ways that I often, when I ran school programs, would teach people to be able to be quote unquote bored on the ergo would be to do things like 4 minutes at rate 18 to 20, which is more of a UT1 kind of intensity, with a minute rest. That minute rest meant that and do that for 20 or 30 minutes. So do it 4 to 6 times. That um, that minute rest allows their heart rate to stay in the right zone, but they can still get a mental refresh regularly so that they feel like they can actually handle doing that type of work and build up their tolerance, I suppose, for being on the ergo for extended periods of time. Today, the load is 3 times 4,000 meters. Is that a good load? What intensity? Yeah, that's probably fine. I'm guessing that is probably like UT1 to or to UT2 to UT1. I think that's probably going to be fine for you. But again, it depends. There's probably a little bit more context needed there around what the expected intensity of it is and that sort of thing. If it's 4,000 meter max 3 times, that's a pretty tough session. But if anaerobic threshold is what you should be targeting, then that's going to be effective at doing that. I've got a high mileage, high intensity camp next week. What should I do this week as I have the week off? So what I wouldn't do is do nothing. I would probably still row three, 3 to 4 times, but I'd just do low intensity work so that your body can be as well recovered. But when you completely stop training, you actually tend to tighten up and you don't necessarily move all that well, and it can actually cause issues with your lower back and things like that because the glutes get a bit lazy and that sort of stuff. So continuing to train is going to help you to still be able to handle that high load and to be able to go through go through a high intensity camp. Be really conscious of trying to get as much sleep as you can. That's the biggest thing people lose, particularly if it's a school camp, because you said you're a junior. um, there's a lot of obviously the team bonding and stuff like that, and people are probably going to want to play up a little bit. That's fine. I was a school aged athlete. I've also run a lot of school camps, and the reality is, if you don't get enough sleep and you don't eat enough, you will break down over camp. So do try and prioritize that, even if it's naps. But getting enough sleep and eating enough is going to make a big difference for you. How to not get bored during long erg sessions. So yeah, like I was saying, uh, start by, if you're not used to it, break it down so that you get those mental breaks more regularly. If you're on your own, find a podcast. Uh, you know, put books on tape, things like that. I find are better than movies, just because find with movies there's often a lot more kind of ups and downs, and I've actually seen people have heart rate spike because there was like a more more action packed part of the movie or whatever. And if you're just trying to stay in zone, it can be a good way to do it. So podcasts are good, but if you're not used to it, if you're not used to being on the erg for a long period of time, and you're like, okay, I'm in winter, I'm going to start doing 80 minutes a day. Yet you're not. You might do it a couple of times, and then you're gonna stop doing it. To be honest, so you're better off building up to it rather than trying to dive straight in. Humans do not like doing things that we don't want to do, and if we do them, we don't do them for long. So build up to it, build your tolerance for it, in the same way that you wouldn't expect to physically be able to, you wouldn't expect to be able to lift a really heavy weight without doing any training. You shouldn't expect your brain to be able to lift a heavy mental weight of doing really long ergs or long sessions of any type if you haven't built it up to that. Some advice there for as well. Don't think about it. Yeah, well, that's where like the podcast and things like that can help, because if you can distract yourself, then that helps you to not be thinking about how long you've got to go or that it's boring or anything like that, because you're listening to a podcast, particularly something you enjoy. Thank you for your valuable input. You're very welcome. I have 2K tests come up in January. Actually, I think I answered that one earlier. I can see the script. Okay, I think I have caught up on Instagram there, which is great. One more comment here. If your race is a 5K to 15/20K, would you still recommend 2 bottlenecks per week? Yes, but what you probably need to do is the analysis tool that I use there is going to be is geared around 2,000-meter racing. It's very applicable to 1,000-meter racing as well. But if your priority event is a head race, it's 5 to 15 or 20K, then I can tell you straight off the bat that the aerobic system is going to be far more important than it's already very important, but it's maybe going to be 90 or 95% of the overall energy demands of the event. So the bottleneck testing is definitely less applicable. It is likely to be your aerobic system, but I would still take the same approach. But I would just make those bottleneck sessions aerobic hard sessions. So that might be anaerobic threshold training, or depending if you do, if you are weaker in those other areas, then potentially more of like your VO2 max type work. So things like 4x4 minutes on at pretty close to 2K pace with 4 or 5 minutes rest in between. Things like that. 4x1K, 8x500s. You might still do some of those sort of classic sessions as your hard session, but I'd still focus on 2 bottleneck sessions a week. Because the principle there is that you want to be able to do those sessions to a standard that allows you to actually drive performance outcomes. And to do that properly, you need to be sufficiently recovered to be able to actually do them. All right, with that, I think I have officially caught up with all of the questions. Thank you so much for joining me. It was a bit of more of a marathon effort than I expected. Hour and 42 minutes. Thanks to anyone who was here the whole time. Really appreciated it. Hopefully you got plenty out of it. Reminders though, on the YouTube caption, there is the link there for the testing protocol. There's the link for the training zone calculator if you want to know how to be in the correct UT2 zone. And if you're interested in my one-to-one coaching program, there's also a link there